Hi, this is a good turnout, right? This is good. I'm Kate Perry. I have a small farm up the road, and my mom and I, we live next to each other. We're co-sponsoring this. We've all been barraged in the last 10 or so years with the idea that reducing or eliminating meat consumption is better for the environment and for our health. In my opinion, this is the opposite of what we should be hearing. I believe that eating meat is one of our main paths to improving and maintaining our health, as it is one of the most nutrient-dense foods we can consume. Ideally, the animals would be raised sustainably and humanely, but it's important to keep in mind that every food budget is different. In regards to the environment, livestock, when raised responsibly and sustainably, absolutely should be part of a comprehensive program to reverse climate change. Thankfully, regenerative practices have been growing in popularity among farmers as more and more learn that there are numerous benefits and profit in responsibly managing land and animals. Irresponsible farming to me mainly means using chemical weed killers and fertilizers, abusing the land and soil, and confining animals, among other concerns. Unfortunately, it will be a long time before big agriculture, which runs huge feedlots of animals on antibiotics and hormones, will run its course. Until then, we can educate ourselves. Whitney Freeman owns Henny Penny Farm in Ridgefield and raises sheep, pigs, chickens, and turkeys. I've known her for over 7 years now and have learned so much from her and continue to learn each year. Whitney combines in-depth research, hands-on experience, and an incredible amount of energy to do her valuable work every day. In addition to her farm and the nearby pastures that she grazes in Ridgefield, she's currently grazing sheep and their llama protectors at Jean's farm here in Reading, along with pigs starting in the next week or two, and chickens on an adjacent Reading land trust parcel. Her short time grazing in Reading and her mentoring me on best practices with my own grazing is doing so much good it astounds me. Building topsoil, improving soil health and fertility, reducing invasive plants and erosion, increasing biodiversity, and more. I tend to be quite verbose about regenerative agriculture, so I will stop myself here and turn it over to Whitney. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here tonight. I have some slides. I'm going to try to make it more of a conversation so we don't totally focus on the slides, but we're going to talk about regenerative farming and how you can eat better and save the planet. So we all shop in supermarkets, and we've been trained to look at the labels and look for the information to suggest if that's the product for you. Take a box of crackers. You're going to look at the ingredients. You might look for something it has or doesn't have. You might have heard that you shouldn't eat corn syrup or you shouldn't eat monosodium glutamate. You might look at the calories or fiber or sugar, whatever is relevant in your mind to yourself. And so these numbers are on the food to help guide you. But what about the foundation ingredients for all of those processed foods? So if we go over to the produce section in that supermarket, how do you decide what to buy? Right now, if you go in the supermarket, you're going to find conventional and organic. They have their labels, and the organic's usually in one section and conventional's everywhere else. And a lot of times in the supermarket, they look identical. The organic might even look a little smaller. To some people, they may even taste the same. So here you are, you're standing in this huge supermarket with no particular connection to nature at that moment in time, and you're trying to decide, should you buy the organic, should you buy the conventional? Is it a scam? Are you just having your money taken? And so you're trying to figure out what to buy, and honestly, just as there is variation in skills, in careers that have training, education, and ongoing education, like doctors and lawyers, there is varying degrees of skill in farming. And there's varying degrees of what people are capable of given the constraints of our capitalist economy. I mean, that's the reality, right? That's what the metrics of farming for years has focused on: high volume and low input and high production, right? So it's really monetarily focused. So what I'm going to present today might not be convenient, because it turns out that producing the most nutritious food for our body and the planet planet is not a simple formula that can be applied in every location. It needs to be looked in terms of context, and simple labels and numbers aren't actually enough for you to be able to pick what's going to be the most nutritious food for you. So, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. If you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. So back in 2008, a friend of mine gave me Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma. How many of you read that book? Okay, so quite a few of you. For me, it completely changed how I look at everything. And at that point onwards, I thought, well, how can I ever eat chicken if I don't raise it myself? So that began my personal journey, which evolved into Henny Penny Farm, which opened in 2015. The good news for you now is that in 2024, there are a lot more options that are easily accessible beyond you starting your own farm to raise your own chicken. But to get us to a place to understand how we as a society have allowed food that we put in our bodies to become so varied in terms of taste and nutritious value, we need to, in order for us to discuss how eating better is going to save the planet, we got to address what regenerative farming is. So that's a word that, like back in 2015, I don't even think I'd heard of that word yet. I think even in the first few years of Henny Penny, I think we were regeneratively farming, but we didn't have a label to put on it yet. And so why regenerative farming focuses on life underground. So regenerative farming is not a new idea by any stretch, but it's a title we finally given to practices that many indigenous people have practiced for generations. And so it's a convenient label because now we can say, okay, this is how I farm. Because before I had to give a very long description of what I was doing with all of these animals moving in progression together. So regenerative agriculture is a conservation and rehabilitation approach that focuses on soil health, which is the foundation of good agriculture. So this picture here is a bunch of bison in a field. One of the principles of regenerative agriculture is trying to mimic how the land was when we had great herds of bison and elk roaming North America. And what they did that was beneficial for the soil, because when you take something out of the ecosystem, right, everything changes. It also increases the carbon carrying capacity of soil and keeps carbon moving in a cycle. And we're going to come back to the carbon cycle later. I am trying to keep our talk so we don't get too much in the weeds and we're not too much of a science lecture, but you do need to know this part. So, the principles of soil health, these are kind of the foundations of how we farm and how regenerative farming looks. I'm going to give you most examples tonight in context of livestock farming. Regenerative agriculture does depend on having ruminants part of that. So that's things that sheep, goats, cows, they're ruminants, so they have this fermentation going on in their gut and they're composting basically. They're like little mobile composting machines. So they are an important linchpin in this system of farming. It doesn't mean everybody has to have those animals, but they do need to have that source of manure somehow part of it, whether you're growing vegetables or meat. But we are meat farmers. So you want to maximize biodiversity. That means all different types of vegetables or plants and different types of animals, maximize soil cover, maximize living roots in the soil, and minimize disturbance, meaning you're not tilling. So I thought it would be helpful to show you what we're going to get in a moment to what that looks like on our farm. But before that, so we're going to talk about maximize living roots in the soil. So the picture on the left, that's what we want to aim for, to see all those roots down. The soil has clumps of soil, there are air pockets, there's ways for water to infiltrate, there's ways for air to get in there. It's not compacted. The soil on the right is heavily compacted, so when it rains really hard, that rainwater just rushes off the surface. That's how you have issues for water runoff, and therefore you can have contaminants going into your waterways. So we're aiming for on the left. And when you're in the system on the left, everything thrives above the ground and below the ground. And so this gives you our context. So what's interesting is even myself going back and looking at pictures I took 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and how I looked at it then and how I look at it now has evolved, right? The more we learn, the more we look back and go, oh yeah, it doesn't look like what I was thinking. So the picture on the top is 2016, at the end of my first month of grazing those pastures. And at the time, I didn't really know what I was looking at. Now I know from having worked with these fields, we still graze these fields now, is that they were heavily compacted from years of what's called continuous grazing. So it was years of cows being in one spot for an extended period of time. And so the soil underneath looked like that picture on the right. And I didn't realize it at the time. And so what happens is that the plants just couldn't thrive because they were trying to grow in this really densely compacted soil. And at the time, I thought, oh, it's very beautiful. It looks like these like fields of wheat. But no, those were very unhappy plants. And when they're really tall like that, there's really no nutritious value at that point for the animals either. You don't want it to get that tall. You want it to be shorter. So then you fast forward to 2021. So this is still 3 years ago. At this point, I had been grazing these fields, which just sheep at this point, and we would move them daily to little mini paddocks within that. So that's like a 5-acre field. So basically it had cows on it. At the time I had 6 sheep and 8 lambs. So I had like, 8 lambs are tiny. It's like the equivalent of like 8 sheep on 5 acres. In hindsight, it's like they do nothing. 8 sheep on 5 acres it's like trying to mow your garden with scissors. Like they're just not gonna do anything. But it was a good learning curve. It was a good way. What I learned how to do was observe and to look and to watch. And honestly, anywhere you start on a new property, just like we're at Jean's farm now, first step is just observe. Look and see what the land is telling you, see what the plants are telling you. And so I learned by looking at it, I was like, okay, so the plants were not thriving. So what we started doing was we brought the sheep in, we divided it into small paddocks, and we would move the sheep every day, and in the beginning, we used their little feet to put seeds down into the soil. So all those plants you see in there, we had seeded earlier in the season, and they're annuals. So annuals are a great tool for rehabilitating soil. We're not really looking at perennials yet, because until the paddocks are really in a place where we're seeing those soil agglomerates where the water can infiltrate, there's no point in putting down perennials. They're just not gonna grow. They won't. So we use the sheep in a very tight group. So you're putting a ton of sheep in a very small space. You put the seeds down and then you move them maybe in the afternoon even. Sometimes it was a half day. And so they push the seeds down, we go to the next spot, we go to the next spot. And then once they got all the seed down, we move back and not come back to that field for at least a month, probably longer. For that, it was probably 2 months. And then this is a couple weeks after grazing and new seedlings are emerging. And so you can see already the difference between the top and the bottom, right? You have a ton of diversity there. And it turns out that that diversity is so important. And it really doesn't even matter what you're putting in. You need to have in your fields, you're gonna have grasses, legumes, and forbs. Forbs are the like broadleaves plants that are not grass. Forbs are the plants that your Scots lawn mixes are trying to get rid of, right? If you wanna have your sod lawn that's perfect grass, that's what you're getting rid of. But when I look at that, I just see like, it's a dead space. It's just synthetic. You might as well have astroturf. It's nothing alive in that. So we want forbs. I'm happy when we get what's called weeds. I'm like, yay, I have another plant. Because we're basically trying to create a smorgasbord for the animals to eat. And we'll talk about why that's important later. So the picture on the left, the continuous grazing, that's what was the field when we first arrived. So the water's sitting on the surface, there's no biological activity, there's really short roots. Then typical rotational grazing, that's when you move like every week. And so then things start to get better, but you still have a little bit of water on the surface, the roots aren't as deep. The third picture, that's adaptive grazing, which is what regenerative farming is. So that's where you adapt to what you're seeing. And that is how we've been farming for about, this is our 4th season now, where we move from rotational to adaptive. That means that in springtime, we're moving every day or every half day, but then come fall, we're moving maybe every 3 days. And it depends on what we're seeing in the field, we're going to move accordingly, not just, okay, it's once a week, we move the animals no matter what. It's not that kind of formula, because to go from the middle to the end, that's what it takes. So it is called labor-intensive farming, So the better the food you want, the more labor intensive it is, which is why this is not popular with big ag. Because it takes a lot of learning how to observe your animals and observe the grass. And it's nothing you can just, there's no formula for this. So every place is different, every field is different. Every year we return to the same paddock, it's a different palette of plants, and it reflects the year before. So it's nuanced and it's constantly changing. So this is a picture of, I just want to show you a close-up of, so at the roots, around the roots you have there's millions, I think billions, of microorganisms and fungi and bacteria. And they've learned that they live symbiotically with the plants. And so the soil is teeming with all of this life. And actually at the root zone, well, in all environments, when you have those edge effects, that's where there's the most amount of biological activity. It's basically all the things that live that rely upon the thing which it's next to. So basically these microorganisms rely upon the roots of these plants. They live together. They get the root exudates, which are listed up there, like organic acids, small molecules, hormones. And in return, when the plants need something, like if the plants are under some kind of stress, like a drought or an insect attack, the plant will signal to the microorganism for nutritional backup, and the right organism will come and be like, here you go. Which is mind-blowing when you think about it, right? But we're more farming a farm underground than we are farming up top, right? We have to get all of those bacteria happy, or microorganisms, the fungi, happy so that the plants thrive, so that the animals thrive. So if you put synthetic fertilizers down, it kills all of that. All those microorganisms leave. And then when they're gone, well, it's fine, you have plants, they're still alive, but now your plants are completely dependent upon those synthetic fertilizers that you need to apply, like an IV drip to your plants. They are addicted to it. They can't survive without it. So you might as well have an artificial growing environment at that point. The soil is then not doing what it's meant to be doing, not only for the plants, but for the environment. So all of this is, we don't want to look at it. So all of this is interconnected. And we talk about soil and dirt. A lot of times people use them interchangeably. Dirt, my kids call like the ground dirt. I'm like, no, it's not dirty, it's soil. Dirt is just the matrix of sand or loam or silt. It's the building block. But soil is alive. Soil is filled with living creatures. That is the foundation for all of this. Soil is beautiful. So when we talk about that, talking about soil and what it does is kind of like saying, well, what does your central nervous system do? Or what does your lymphatic system do? It is so complicated and interrelated. It's not just one simple answer, right? So it's related to the health of the plants, which is related to the populations of birds, which is related to the animals that are thriving on that land. Not all animals are going to do well on a particular pasture if it's not thriving in a certain way. And in fact, we sometimes do a succession of animals that can, like some animals can tolerate poorer soils or plants than others. Our ruminants, definitely our sheep are more demanding in terms of their needs. You can choose goats that are a little less demanding, but you have to pair your genetics of your animals with what you're looking at in terms of your pasture. So, talking of it being interrelated, it's the same as like when I go to a dentist, there's a sign on the wall that talks about how oral hygiene is related to heart and lung health. And I can relate when I was a kid, my terrier had horrible rotted teeth. And she eventually got pulmonary fibrosis. And I remember the vets at the University of Pennsylvania said it was because of all the toxins coming from her teeth long-term into her body that gave her pulmonary fibrosis. So like we've known this stuff for a really long time. So why would we assume that the soil and that interconnectedness would be any less complicated than our own bodies? And what's amazing is that a lot of the systems you see in one area, you just see nature repeating it over and over in different in different iterations. So the reason I mentioned this also is that you need to continue your observational skills. It's a lifelong pursuit, making I wonder something part of your vocabulary, and maybe not just turning right to Google to find your answer. Sometimes you need to look at it, and maybe because there isn't the answer on Google. So you're looking at the soil, there might not be anybody else who's had that same experience where what they're seeing. So sometimes you just have to keep observing and kind of deduce it yourself. So we go through an exercise of taking soil samples as well to get reports so we can understand what pH we have, what nutrients, macro and micronutrients, and it is helpful. But honestly, I probably get more information looking at the weeds growing in our fields than I do a soil test, because the soil test in the end is going to tell me apply this and apply that. But I would rather not apply anything and just maybe choose some different plants, do different seeds to put down this year, and let the soil do what it needs to do. So when we first started in those fields, there was a field, I couldn't find the picture, but it was filled with thistle. And at the time, I think I was like, well, I must be doing something wrong. But I wasn't doing anything wrong. The soil was doing what it was meant to do. The thistle was trying to, it has big tap roots, right? It's drawing nutrients from down below. It's helping create these air pockets. It also was a huge benefit for all the pollinators. It had all of these butterflies and bumblebees on it, so the nature was quite happy. I wasn't happy because it was very spiky and it was really hard to put the fencing in. And mowing it down was terrible, and I only had a little Sears Craftsman tractor, so the tractor was like this high, and the thistle was like this high, and it burnt the tractor out. And so I was trying to fight it, and it burned the engine. It just welded onto itself. So it was, it was a terrible disaster, but I realized I was fighting it, and that didn't work. So instead, when we had more sheep, the sheep started grazing it. And actually, the rams, like the older boys, they actually like the thistle. They'll seek out the thistle leaves and eat it. The babies don't. The lambs won't eat it, but the older sheep do. And by using them and managing when we put them in, they can graze it, and then other plants, if they graze it down, other plants can thrive. Because what I'm giving the plant in return is I'm giving them manure, right? I'm giving them a stressor, which we'll talk about later, that they need that stressor, that challenge to thrive. So I'm going to show you another example. Then we talked about, remember the 4 principles of soil health? Maximize biodiversity and keep soil covered. So this is an example of what we do at our home farm. So the home farm is tiny, but it's where everybody comes home to lamb, so have their babies. So we have this tiny little area that a lot of sheep come home. And one, we want to keep soil covered because there's a pond right next to it, right? So I don't want all that manure, which is fabulous fertilizer, but if we just let it wash into the pond now, it's something bad and not good, right? So I gotta make sure that we're not allowing all of that just to run into the water. And I also want to protect them from the soil from being compacted, because there's a lot of feet there. They poke down and they're really gonna compact. Well, with sheep, they say they tug it up. So I'm gonna cover it, and what we do is we take a couple of multiple round bales over the course of the season, and we keep putting that out. So it's forming a layer that's protecting the soil. When I say maximize biodiversity, because this spot, it has a cycle over the course of the year. So right now, this is January, right before the sheep come home. Then all the sheep come home, and the llamas, and they'll start having their lambs, let's say February, March. I don't have a picture, which I should do. I've, over the years, not taken pictures of the things that I think on their own look ugly. So the picture that you really should have is what it looks like in early April. Early April, it's
No, you don't. You don't want to see that.
it's very brown, it's very muddy. But it's actually okay, it's part of the cycle. It's basically before all the bacteria and everything else has woken up to do what it needs to do, and it's just that point where it's the tipping point. When it's about time, there's like 2 weeks before the sheep go back to the fields, and before we then start restoring this. And what the next step is, it dries out, which is about now, and we take a tractor and we take out all that bedding that we put in to protect the soil, and now we have a soil layer. We scratch it up, and it's small enough scale we can do that by hand. And we put down seed that's going to help rebuild the soil, aerate it, and eventually become forage. So what we put down, and we do different things every year, that's the whole thing, you gotta mix it up. Last year we put down peas and oats. Peas fix the nitrogen, and the oats help give a great matrix. They really grew up tall, so there's a lot of, and there'll be a lot of carbon, obviously, in those plants. And the sheep would graze it down to a point. It provided great cover as well for the soil, because soil wants to be covered. So if you have a bare patch, you notice like if your grass dies, some weed will come hop in that spot. It doesn't just stay bare dirt as long as there's still life in your soil. So that's a good thing. The weeds are fine. So it goes like that, and then by September, the turkeys come home. So this is about September time. So when I showed you a couple sheep on it, there are just a couple sheep. We might just put 2 or 3 sheep in the summer. It just keeps it down because we're not mowing that. So it's just enough to keep it manageable. Then the turkeys come home. So again, we're mixing up what type of animals are on it. And the turkeys will be on there through Thanksgiving, obviously. And then from November, end of November through almost the end of January, nothing's on it. So we have these periods of rest where nothing's on that land and the soil can recover, and then we cover it back up again. So that's sort of our cycle, how it looks like on our property. And I'm gonna show you. Oh, and this is an example up in the field. So these are those fields on the conservation land of Ridgefield. That is a mobile chicken tractor. When the turkeys are younger, before they can come home, we put them in that as well. And so that we move every day. And again, that land will have chickens and turkeys on it. Then at some point, the sheep will come on it. And so we mix it up to provide the diversity because the sheep and chickens will eat different plants. And that's what you want. You can't just have one species on continuously, because if you don't time it right, they'll just end up eating their favorite plants. And then they're sort of dictating what's continually going to thrive. And so we want to mix it up. So, like I said, what is the land telling us? That's the most important thing. You just have to learn how to start observing and see. So the first thing is about the adaptive grazing. It's going to improve the soil structure. It's going to improve the water filtration through the increased soil agglomerations. That means like the little clumps of soil that gives you the air pockets. It's going to increase the biological diversity of the bacteria and the rhizomatous fungi within the soil. It's going to increase the diversity and density of plants above the soil, which increases the variety and quantities of insects and pollinators and birds. And therefore, obviously, it's a knock-on effect to the larger species as well. And then you're going to have an increased diversity and number within bird populations. So this is the brief bit of a little bit of diagrams. The take home from this, without getting too much in the weeds, is the carbon cycle. Which is really interesting because there's a carbon cycle when the cows, right, everybody knows cows burp methane, so they think they're killing the planet. But there's a cycle, right? So the methane comes out, it goes up, and then it's converted to carbon dioxide and water. When it comes down, the plants take the carbon dioxide, right, with photosynthesis, and they give off oxygen. So we have that cycle going on there. The cows poop, and there's carbon in that too. That's going to go in the soil, and that's going to be feeding all of the fungi, right? It's providing nutrients for them. So that's okay. We have the cycle. It's going around. It's meant to keep moving. Where there starts to become a problem is when you have sources of carbon that are being released deep from under the ground, right? The fossil fuels. Those ones are not meant to be brought up into the atmosphere because now you're really drawing up a lot more carbon. If you don't disturb the cycle, the cows and the grass, you're fine. Now what we're really talking about though when we talk about cows being an issue with methane is if you're in a feedlot, right? Instead of that manure being something beautiful feeding the soil, if it's now a byproduct that we have to dispose of, then that's a lot different, right? We're overpopulating it then. And the reality is we actually don't have any more, the amount of cows that are raised right now are not that much different. It's not that bigger of a scale than back when we had all these bison and elk roaming the world. The difference is that the quantity of cows are being raised in feedlots. If you were raising them on pasture, that's a different thing. The other thing too is that it's sort of a limiting system, a self-limiting system. You can't raise more animals on pasture than what the pasture can support, if in the end you want to have healthy animals and healthy pasture. If you overstock your pastures, you're going to have to supplement somehow, or you're going to have really sick-looking animals or not very good-looking food. So it's not a system that you really can, not if you're responsibly farming. So what I learned recently, because we keep learning stuff, I know all about livestock. I don't know a lot about the oceans. And I realized recently that there's pretty much the same cycle in the oceans that we have in the soil. So there's the same idea of in the surface of the water, right? You have the carbon, same cycle going on with phytoplankton and zooplankton. The phytoplankton are eaten by the zooplankton, so it's kind of like the grass being eaten by the cows. And again, it cycles up, air and sea exchange of carbon dioxide, but then the zooplankton and also animal fish, basically, any poop that goes down to the bottom of the ocean, it's the same idea. Or dead fish, dead zooplankton, over time sinks down to the deep ocean, and it's the same deep reserve of carbon, just like we have on land. So you're seeing the same cycles happening in the water that you see on the land. So when we talk about regenerative farming being able to reverse climate change, absolutely, it is part of a bigger picture of reversing climate change. It can't do it on its own. And in terms of scale, there's 50 times the amount of carbon reserves in the deep ocean as there is in the atmosphere. So to give you kind of a scale, the amount of carbon in the soil is kind of similar. It's more than the amount of the carbon in the carbon-air exchange there, but it's not nearly as much as the deep ocean. So there's fascinating research going on. If you look at like the Woods Hole Institute, of where they're trying to figure out ways to recreate that cycle, because there actually are active carbon pumps within our ocean system that cycles that actively pump carbon down. So it's not just passive. So some of it, yes, is passive sinking to the bottom, some of it is active carbon pumps. And they're trying to think of ways to use that as another way to reverse climate change. Even to the point of like sea kelp. Sea kelp does a similar idea of its sequestering carbon. And if they grow enough sea kelp, can they sink it to the bottom of the ocean to have that as a way to sequester carbon? So we're looking at all of these models. It's all of the same concept, and I think you need to apply it not only in land, but on sea as well. So how do we support this? We look at growing food as a way to restore soils. And think of your garden or farm not like a fish tank, but your connection to the stars, right? It's not something you just add this supplement and that supplement to. You're trying to basically farm under the ground. This last slide, we're going to talk about regenerative farming. These are the 3 rules of being an adaptive steward. So first, everything you do is going to have either a positive or negative effect. Nothing you do is neutral. So you're either going to help it or not help it. And everything you do is going to have a cascading and compounding effect. The disruption we talked about earlier, everything needs disruption to thrive, right? So like you need to go to the gym to get stronger. Your plants need that challenge. They can't just, if you grow plants in a greenhouse and you don't give them exposure to cold, right, and if you just give them a ton of warm and sunlight, they get all leggy. And then you go to put them outside and they can't deal with the wind and the cold. It's too much of a shock. It's the same thing. You can't mollycoddle your plants. Like nature needs that disruption. And then diversity. It's the same thing of what we've been talking about. You need to have diversity of plants, of animals, and under the soil, diversity of the microorganisms. So we kind of addressed this already, talking about the biological diversity in the soil. So great, that helps the soil, but how does it help you? So this is the exciting part, because I gave sort of the first iteration of this talk a couple years ago, and this data we did not have yet. The missing piece was to show that by raising animals in this way or raising vegetables in this way, that they actually have more nutrient value. And while I think everybody thought that, there wasn't actually the data to show it. So I couldn't really say something that you don't have data to prove it. But there are data studies that have emerged that do show that now. So they actually have shown that cow and bison and sheep are what they eat, which is pretty amazing. So they've been using metabolomics, which, again, we won't go into too much of the details of this slide, but basically they took samples of meat and then they used a mass spectrometer, which is using light to be able to identify compounds in the meat. So they did a huge study, it came out in 2023, and I was really fortunate in January to attend the Northeast Pasture and Grazing Consortium, and it was a great experience. It brought together farmers, people from the USDA and services, as well as scientists. So everybody was in the same room, and so you have people who are doing the research and the people who are applying these principles and the people who are sort of funding and facilitating all of this in the same room having these conversations. So Stefan Babli, who is the first author of this article, gave a talk about all of this work he's been doing at the University of Utah. And it was the biggest study to date profiling over 1,500 biochemicals in meat, so that they're starting to pick apart, and that's where we start to get into the weeds. But I do feel that my biggest problem when I look at articles or graphs, you look at, I saw one last month in National Geographic, which it sort of bothers me when I see graphs that they make broad sweeping generalizations or conclusions, let's say, saying like this one was showing it was about textiles, and it actually showed wool as being the second worst textile in terms of environmental impact. And that I think some of these synthetic ones, nylon, or I don't even remember which one, ranked as much better for the environment. And I'm reading it thinking, well, wool is biodegradable, and it's not giving off, you know, the fossil fuels to environment. So what is so bad about wool? And then it has a little asterisk and it says, well, it's because the sheep are the main cause of the methane, which is really bad for the environment. And I'm like, well, but it depends on what questions you're asking, because it's like, well, yes, they give off methane, but as we looked at, it's part of a cycle. So is it really that bad? So it's like, well, how are you analyzing your data? So my biggest advice too is when you're looking at these things, it's fun to quote them because you can be like, look, it says in National Geographic, the second worst thing is wool. But I would want to see the data and how, like, where did they get the data from? How was it analyzed before I go and repeat that information? So to that point, this, I know this is being recorded too, so like this is the most recent paper if you really want to get in the weeds, but it does have the data to support all of the different biomolecules and markers when they looked at the meat of pasture. It's pasture finished versus corn, alfalfa, hay finished. So what they were looking at was maybe confinement raising versus pasture raising. And what they found, again, a little bit of the weeds, but the things in green are what fold difference. So all of these phytochemicals are maybe threefold or fourfold or 17-fold higher in a pasture-raised animal. So or pasture-finished animal, I should say. So what it's really showing you though is that when that animal is being raised on pasture, the meat is different. And it does have more nutritional value. It's not the same piece of meat. And this one, so the conclusion of the whole paper talks about the fatty acid metabolism. So it turns out that the animal is healthier by being on pasture. He has more molecules that help his fatty acid metabolism. What they have not studied next, or what they will be studying is, okay, so the animal was healthier. If we eat that meat, does it mean it's more healthy for us? That's the part they don't know yet. I think we kind of can guess the conclusion, but it's not been shown yet, so we can't say that yet. But this is the first step, and that's how it goes. You know, if you're going to research something, you have to have the data behind it. The other thing to know, when you look at scientific papers, it's really important to look to see who's funded it, because if it's been funded sometimes by like a pharmaceutical company or like the meat board or the vegan board or whoever is founded, it's important to look at who's paid for that research. Sometimes, ideally, it's not been paid for by anything that needs to be disclosed. And the other thing is the impact factor of the journal. Some journals, they're all ranked in how respected they are. So like if you get an article in Nature, that's like the #1. Everybody wants an article in Nature. But there's tons of different journals, and some are better than and more respected than others. And this is actually really old data. This is from 2003, but it was showing that if you grain finish an animal, the phytochemical richness, so those biomolecules, they do decrease on days on basically on the feed ration. So, and there's a lot of science behind feed rations. They're not terrible because, I mean, sometimes like in the winter, right? I don't have pasture for my animals. They have to eat something. So they're gonna have hay. They're gonna have, depends on, you know, if you're doing dairy, they're gonna have hay, they're gonna probably have grain, they need some source of protein. So they've put a lot of research into what the animals need. But know that if you did that for the entire life of the animal, you're gonna have a different product in the end. So let's go back to that supermarket with your 2 peppers, right? Organic versus conventional. So as you can see, by limiting yourself to just those 2 labels, you've kind of excluded all of this other gray area. And if you're talking about big ag, well, that's one thing. Because that way, at least you do know from organic that it's not been sprayed with certain chemicals, it's not been sprayed with things to kill, so herbicides and pesticides. So it absolutely has value. But there's a lot of variation between organic, which is why what you really want to look at is more eating from, ideally, a farmer that you know, or local, because then, or a smaller farm. So the first thing is the freshness of the food. If you're eating seasonally, that's going to be something that's traveled less miles. It's going to be definitely less environmental impact, right? Because it's traveled less miles, but 2, it's supporting your local food system, right? And we can't thrive if we don't support the local food system. And again, eat local, because if you go to the farmers markets, you're going to be getting food that's typically a smaller farm in New England. And a smaller farm is going to be diverse because that's kind of the only way they can survive or thrive. And a diverse farm is more likely to be regeneratively farming. And most farms now that do practice this are saying that very much. They're happy to talk about their practices. A lot of farms are, you know, integrated with livestock and vegetables, because you kind of need, if you're going to do vegetables, livestock is a tremendously helpful part of it. You can do the other, as in we don't do vegetables, we only do livestock. And there's great resources. So if you go on to Connecticut NOFA, which is Northeast Organic Farming Association, so ctnofa.org, there's a whole guide for farmers markets and CSAs. So you can put in what county you're in, what town you're in, and find out what farms are out there. There are CSAs for winter, there are CSAs for summer. And if you start trying foods that are in season, one, you're probably gonna try foods you've not had before. And the biggest key then is it starts to allow you to cook. And when you're not eating those heavily processed foods, it is so much healthier for you. I mean, that's the biggest thing you can do. If you could commit to even 1 month of really trying to just eat local, buy from your farmers markets, it'll take you a little while to necessarily notice the difference maybe, because sometimes people say, well, it doesn't taste that much difference, but it sometimes takes a little while for your palate to become attuned to the maybe more subtle flavors. However, that being said, if you've never had fresh asparagus from a farmer's market, I highly recommend in the next couple weeks to get to a farmer's market, because it's nothing like what you'd have in the supermarket. And ask your farmers how they cook, because the farmers are the best people to tell you how to cook the thing that they grew, because they're going to be eating it too, right? So I have a picture here of, actually it's a smoked pork hock. that I cooked maybe last month. I'm not the best photographer, but at least it shows you it was black beans Cuban style with a smoked pork hop, and it was amazing. And those cuts, eating those cuts that you maybe don't see in the supermarket, that's because maybe they're not part of our everyday cooking style anymore, but those are the ones that will be very nutritious. They're going to be more flavorful. Honestly, my favorite cuts are usually not the ones, it's not the rib chops and the loin chops. They're good, but that's because it's really easy to cook. You just pan sear and you're done. The ones that require slower cooking to break down the muscle, they have so much more flavor, and there's so much nutrition in that food. So that's one of the best ways to eat better, is to choose these cuts that are a little different, choose vegetables that are a little different, but talk to your farmers. Whenever I go to the vegetable stand in the farmer's market, I'll be like, or even ask them, what's really special this week? What should I try? Because they're the ones that are going to guide you, and if you cultivate that relationship, you know, they'll see you next week, they'll remember you and say like, oh, you need to try this. I know you love that, you should try this week. And you're really lucky that, you know, there are so many farmers markets around here, and there's many days per week. They're not just weekends, so if you can't go on a weekend, there's a lot of weekday markets around. If you go on that Connecticut NOFA site, also the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, where I showed you this little seasonal diagram, it also has what farmers markets are going on there as well. And we do have a huge range of vegetables in Connecticut that you can eat, even in the winter. When you go to the farmer's market, there's still vegetables. It's different vegetables, and maybe if you use it to guide how you cook, there's still a lot of nutrition. So you don't really need to get much at the supermarket. Some farmer's markets, we sell down in Larchmont, there's a vendor that grows rice in upstate New York. So, I mean, you can really get a tremendous amount of food from Connecticut, New York. You know, it's not that far from us. So I think that's my guide to, you know, basically keep cooking, learning, and reading. I put a few books on here that I've enjoyed. Dan Barber's The Third Plate, again, an older book. I think that was maybe 2013, but he's really talking about changing how we eat, not being such a meat-centric diet, but maybe meat part of it, not the centerpiece of our diet. Michael Pollan's In Defense of Food. If you're thinking of farming with livestock, Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown is a great book. Sacred Cow, that's one that really is talking about if you're thinking like, well, should we be eating meat, and the various questions related and around that, that's a great book to look at. If you want a really long, comprehensive list of reference books, the Bionutrient Food Association has a great list. I have not read everything on their list by any means, but there's a huge plethora of books on there. So at this point, I mean, we'll open it up if anybody has questions. I'm happy to answer anything.
Yeah, thanks. Really good talk, by the way. So when I'm doing my, vegetable gardening in the summer in pots, how do I make sure that soil's happy and healthy? What can I do?
Well, one thing I used to do when I grew in containers, I used to make like a compost tea. I actually grow comfrey in our farm, and comfrey is amazing. And by growing it, what's nice, it's not like you need to be bringing in manure. So it's like if you don't have, I like having a closed loop in my farm if I can. So comfrey, you buy it as like little crowns, and you put them in the soil, and it comes back year after year, so it's a perennial, so it's going to keep supporting the soil. But you take those leaves and you can put it in a bucket of water, and you can turn it into, it's basically fermenting, and I used to put a little air bubbler in and water that onto my containers. It was like a fertilizer, but you would get more biological activity because obviously the bacteria on the leaf. And so basically it's compost tea. If you look up compost tea, that was a great one. You could also, if you're nearby a farm, obviously you could bring in a little bit of manure. And as well, some people ask us sometimes if we have extra wool, because the wool you can put in your containers and it'll break down and release the protein and nutrients to the plants, and it helps with holding moisture. So sometimes people will ask to put some wool in their containers as well. So those would be my 3 favorites for containers. But that's, there's all kinds of creative ways to do that. Anything else?
I have a question about, it's sort of a multifaceted question about site selection,
Yeah.
small holding, like 1 to 2 acres, forested, hilly land, which is obviously in abundance here. If somebody, I mean, you're using pastures
Right.
and moving around. If
Yeah.
somebody wanted to stay on one piece of land,
Yeah.
you're looking at contamination from runoff from surrounding hills. You're looking at clearing enough space to be functional, and there obviously are some downsides to clearing as well.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of think through the metrics on that in a way that is responsible?
Well, sometimes some land is not conducive to certain farming practices.
Right.
So it might be looking at the land that you have and say, well, that's maybe not an ideal location for ruminant farming. And maybe that land might be better for smaller livestock, or you might be able to do pigs, you might be able to do ducks, but maybe it could be something like mushrooms. It could be choosing what you're going to raise to suit the land. So, and I agree, like clearing has to be very well thought out. I wouldn't just broadly clear areas because the knock-on effect is huge, and all the runoff. There are, so agroforestry is that kind of area. That agroforestry I've not really done a lot in. I know when I was at the consortium, there were a couple businesses that do consult on that, and I could, so I didn't bring any business cards or anything, but Henny Penny Farm is the farm. If you go on the website, we have an email on there, and you could email me. I could give you their contacts. But basically, if you're thinking that maybe this land could potentially work for, let's say, pigs, but you need to clear a little bit, you can work with an agroforestry ecologist to help you select what trees you should keep and which ones you should get rid of. Because there are certain trees that maybe are like keystone species for there, and there are other trees that you could maybe get rid of. But that is very skilled, and so I think that you want to work with someone who really knows about that. But in the meantime, if you only have a couple acres, you try a little something, and I think baby steps. That's how I've usually done everything with ours. Like, we didn't start with like 80 sheep on the fields. We started with 6. And then we kind of watched, and it does allow you to kind of observe better. If you start with a lot of an animal, or you start with big gestures, even if you're not doing animals, sometimes it's going to get away from you before you can fix it. So I would say, look at the land, maybe try things small scale first. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
Yes?
What is your advice for people who have a lot of property, but we don't necessarily need it all? It's not, like I have a big field and my husband mows it, but like maybe we don't need to mow it, but I don't know that we could have
That's
animals.
an easy one to answer.
Awesome.
I can answer that one easy. So there's a Connecticut Farm Link
Okay.
and Connecticut Farm Finder, and because I follow that too, and there are always people posting, you can have your property listed as potentially, they're trying to put together farmers and people with land. And a lot of times, most of the times, what I'm seeing lately, it's like 1 acre, 2 acres. It's not, or even it's a half acre, it's not like 100 acres. So it's usually not people with 100 acres looking for a farmer, it's someone like, I have an acre in Reading, would anybody, and then what you do is you say, I want someone just to grow, you can limit it. You can say, I might only be interested in someone who's growing vegetables, or maybe just chickens, but no this or that. And you just put it up there and you're gonna post it. But farmers look at it all the time, and they have their profiles, and so they might reach out to you, or you can reach out to a farmer.
Interesting.
So yeah, Connecticut Farm Link, Connecticut Farm Finder, those would be your places to go.
Cool.
Yeah.
I was reading Michael Pollan and omnivores, and then also the food rules. And then around that time, I also watched that documentary, Food Inc., and I learned more about the food lobby and the laws around food.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you happen to know, whenever I speak to like a dietitian, someone who's been formally trained in the system kind of thing,
Yeah.
they never talk about, like if I ask like, do you recommend organic strawberries, for instance,
Yeah.
which is like, and they always say that there's like no evidence, the nutritional value of a strawberry there's no evidence or anything. And I'm wondering, because these are the people who are like consulting with schools and bigger places, and like, is it the lobby that is stopping? It seems like common sense, like it just seems like, I'm wondering if you know anything about that.
Well, I think it's probably because like that data, even like what I showed you, it only just came out last year. So I think for a long time, there was no data showing that, and I don't know that there's still the data saying that organic is better. But there is the data starting to show that, well, they're starting at the meat level. I guess it's partly because it's really complicated to show a direct connection between like, so with the animal one, it's like, okay, you can show a connection between, they first showed that the animal is what it eats. They showed that there was molecules that were in cyanobacteria and things that are near the soil surface and actinomyces that could only be from plants, and then they showed it in the animal. So like the animal connection was easier. I'm not sure
So
if
it's
it
the
does.
tobacco industry again, it's like there's no direct evidence that smoking causes
Right.
cancer, but
It's
you know,
exactly
these are-
like that, right? And so it's the same thing, but I don't know that it's a lobby. I just don't know that they've done they don't have all the data yet to prove it, even though we kind of can connect the dots, but it's partly to the point of like organic. If you buy an organic pepper at the supermarket versus if I bought an organic pepper from, let's say, one of the farms I know at the farmer's market, I know that they farm really diversely and that their soil is thriving and alive. The organic pepper that's been done in a big ag farm, maybe really far away, it might not be as nutrient dense as, because I know that even the research that Van Vliet did on the meat, his data on the grass-fed, grass-finished beef, he said even in that there was a huge spectrum. So statistically it was better, but there were some farms that were like way off the charts in terms of nutrient density and others that were like down here. So it's such a variety because that's why it's nice to buy from a local farm that you can really see like how sustainable is it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I've been a small-scale organic farmer for most of my life, so this all makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to double-check, so there's no pesticides, herbicides, insecticides used, right?
For what?
For regenerative farming.
So that's interesting because I'll follow on some regenerative farming groups online and across the country.
Right.
I would say the vast majority of people who regeneratively farm do not. However, I do read, because it's not an official label, this is where it's nice to know your farmer, because it's not.
Right. So it's not like the organic farm program, which has many problems, but there's no protocol that you have to follow.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to double check.
Correct. So there are some farmers, like I've read some farmers, not in this area, like far out west, that they're talking about, big swathes of land. And there was a whole argument in one group I was following, and one person's like, well, I always just spray these one plants, blah, blah, blah. And then other people say, well, then you can't be regenerative farming. And he's like, well, no, but yeah, so there is
Yeah,
no.
so you have to be very careful with all these things.
Correct.
It's,
So like we don't.
right.
And I don't think most regenerative farmers around here would, but yes, that's why you really have to
If
know.
I could just add a little bit,
Mhm.
that everybody needs to, I've studied this stuff probably like you have. I mean, our whole society is based on cheap fossil fuel. It
Yeah.
has been since, it's like, the last 200 years. We're in a period of human history that's unprecedented, and we think it's normal, and it's not.
No.
So one thing that happened is the whole system is based on fossil fuel, and the industrial ag system is based on cheap fossil fuel. So when these feedlot systems are based on feeding the animals corn and soybeans, which are grown with diesel fuel running the tractors, and also through the Haber-Bosch process, which takes nitrogen out of the air and makes ammonia and injects it into the soil. Every ton of ammonia that's produced from the nitrogen in the air, which is not available to plants, N2. Plants can't use it. When it's turned into ammonia, 1 ton, through the Haber-Bosch process, produces 1 ton of CO2. So I think it accounts for like 8% of the CO2 globally. Just that. So bottom line is another 10, 20, 30 years is going to have to be a lot more small farmers.
Yeah.
And food is going to be a lot more expensive. And that's what's coming.
Yeah.
But you don't see that in the New York Times.
No, and that's
Because it makes trouble.
It does. It's like it's the inconvenient truth.
Yeah.
The inconvenient truth is you're really going to need the small farmers because in the end, big ag is not going to help us.
Yeah. And it's, if right now, if you're a corn soybean farmer, you can farm like 10,000 acres. And the machines are wider than this room.
Yeah.
And they can do it, a couple of guys can do it. But it's only because oil is what, $80 a barrel? If it goes up to $200, $300 a barrel,
It's not going to
who
work.
knows what's gonna happen?
Yeah.
So,
No.
yeah, I'm
Absolutely
flying the ointment.
Yeah. Yeah, small farmers would definitely be your answer.
But we need small farmers.
Yeah. And there is a tremendous, we're in New England, there's a tremendous, resurgence of young farmers or young aspiring farmers, and land is our biggest issue.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
It's just,
I'm lucky, I'm on land that's been in the family. That's the only reason I'm here. I mean, I'm not making money.
no, I don't think any farmers
It's
are
like-
making money.
But we still have to pay the taxes, so
Yeah.
that's why we're working on the zoning regulations.
What about raising farmers here?
We need to keep farmers around, somebody that knows how to grow food when the shit hits the fan.
Yeah, because it's definitely past knowledge. It's not something like you can't just read it in a book and learn it all enough to produce a quality product over and over.
It's a lot of hard knocks.
Yeah. And you gotta be able to do it, adapt.
Hopefully everybody knows Bill Hill, who Bill Hill is. He owns Warp's farm in Reading, so he's Reading's farmer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my son and.
Sorry, and Lincoln and Cody, of
Yeah.
course, but I feel like you needed an introduction. Because you're a staple in town.
Yeah. Any others? Yeah.
I have a question about backyard chicken coops, which
Yeah.
are increasingly popular.
Yeah.
There's obviously a very interactive relationship with the bear population and backyard chicken coops. And so I guess my question is about the pros and cons of that, right? On the one hand, great, you're producing your own eggs and you might have, if you're making that choice, that might be leading you to other choices, right? It's like sort of
The gateway drug.
exactly. But the ability for people to reasonably and responsibly interact with the wildlife population is not, it's problematic.
Oh, you mean like, are you asking,
So
like how do people navigate, for example,
how do
not
you navigate
interfering?
that well?
I mean, I think there's ways to deter the bears. I mean, we use electric fencing a lot.
Electric fencing is, from what I understand, really the only
Yeah, and it's pretty easy.
foolproof way to do it.
I think initially it's a little overwhelming because you're like, how do I do all this? But like, I mean, Premier One Supplies is who we get all our fencing from. They have a pretty comprehensive guide to every possible fencing you could get now. And it's pretty straightforward. And the zap from it won't kill anything. I mean, we've all touched it, and it's not, it's,
Too many times.
yeah. It's a zap, but it's not going to kill the bear. And so
No.
that's a safe way to be able to have chickens. And yeah, it's a great way they're a great way to start with livestock.
I guess my question is sort of a little bit deeper than that, and it's not at all meant to be disrespectful, but bears are already in residential neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But if you're partaking of this gateway drug,
Okay.
but you don't yet know enough
Right.
to put up electric fencing, or you would love to, but that's really prohibitively expensive, or all kinds of
Okay.
reasons.
Yeah.
Are you doing a disservice to your
Chickens
to
without.
your chickens by putting them in an environment where they are likely not to survive, or to your 2 or 3 mile radius of neighbors,
Yeah.
because you're basically putting out bait. No, and please, I'm very much a fan of backyard chicken coops. I'm just sort of trying to think about the bigger picture on that.
I don't know how, I mean, I haven't had a ton of interactions with bears. I don't know how much bait they are. I mean, I would say it's more bait for like fox, coyotes, weasels,
Right.
those guys for sure. And it's very seasonal. I don't think of it really as there's so, I mean, particularly in Reading, like there's so much woods and wildlife here for them to go eat. I don't know if you're cooped with a few chickens. I mean,
I have a
So
little,
do you
little
have a-
bear story. So we've
Yeah.
had livestock over the years, and we had some goats and we had chickens forever, but I put up one of those electric net fences.
yeah,
And they're very easy to put up, but you do have to have a clear, just make sure the grass, if there's a lot of weeds, it's not.
yeah, you gotta mow before
You
you
gotta
put
mow
it
it down, you have to have a very powerful charger, like at least 3 joules, which is measured in joules. You gotta have it, because it gives you punch.
Right.
And we have bears, and one time I was walking on the fence, there was a big bear turd on the outside of the electric fence, so they probably tested the fence, or maybe they can probably sense that it's on,
Yeah.
but they could just knock the fence down, but they didn't, and so they do work.
They
But
do.
they have to be
And the
charged
cost-
all the time.
And the cost of the fence is a lot less than the chicken coop. The chicken
Yeah.
coop is
And
really
feeding
expensive.
Yeah,
them,
the
and
fence
feeding
is,
the chickens.
it's the charger, well, I mean, it's like,
Yeah, the chickens, like,
it's not bad.
if you're raising chickens, you're doing it because you're gonna have a better quality egg, not because it's gonna be cheap, because it's gonna be really expensive. They're like the most expensive eggs you can have,
Yeah.
but they're better and
They
it's
But
delicious.
the eggs are so good.
Yeah, it is.
Can I speak to the predator
Yeah.
situation in Reading just a little bit, just because we've dealt with it, and electric fencing on both the coop and the run. If you have the space and the wherewithal to deal with livestock guardian dogs who like to bark and will roam if they're not properly contained, we haven't lost a chicken or a duck to, except for that hiking dog the other day, to a predator, to a wildlife predator since probably I moved there, because our livestock guardian dogs are on it. They're also on it with hawks. So if you have the setup where you can have LGDs, that's helpful, but that's a pretty big step. But electric fencing isn't cost prohibited, and if I learned how to do it right before I met Whitney, because that stuff confuses the hell out of me, it's not that bad to learn.
You
But
can
you
call
wanna
them too.
secure your coop around here, because people leave out their garbage cans.
Right.
People leave out a lot of stuff that really tempts the bears, and they start learning to like come up to homes. But I don't think you're doing a disservice by having chickens. I don't think you're like feeding the wildlife or baiting for people
It's not like a
around
bird
you.
feeder, like a bird feeder is
Oh,
like
bird
just-
feeders
that's
and garbage cans.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
that's
kinda-
exactly what's in town.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but like the chicken coop, not so
Yeah,
much.
bears love bird feeders.
Yeah, you know what, another guard, like, so we don't have guardian dogs, we've always used, we use a turkey to protect our chickens, we use a goose to protect our turkeys and our ducks, so we've always had a predator, and then the llamas protect the chickens. But the tom turkey has always been a phenomenal protector for our chickens. Not to the point of like, he's not gonna take on a coyote, but he's much better at watching the sky than a rooster, like I lost so many roosters before I had a turkey. But yeah, I don't think, out of all the things to be bait, the chickens probably not so much, as long as you have the fencing.
Okay.
Yeah,
So who's hitting on
any others? Good.
Whitney, thank
you so much.